For those of you who don't know, buff spells are spells that increase a skill of a target in some way and are largely considered beneficial effects. So in this video we'll go over some of the best buff spells you can pick up. Starting us off at number 10, we have the second level ability, Enhance Ability. This spell allows you to touch a creature and grant them the abilities of a specific animal, and you can choose which one. The abilities grant advantage on specific skill checks as well as secondary abilities. For example, Bear's Endurance gives a target advantage on Constitution checks and grants you 2d6 temporary hit points, which are lost when the spell ends. Being able to gain temp HP is usually considered a pretty decent ability by itself. Cure Wounds, a first level spell that when cast at second level heals for 2d8. In comparison to being able to gain 2d6 temporary HP plus advantage on Constitution checks as well as other possible effects. So while Cure Wounds is slightly more health, this spell has slightly more flexibility. While the rest of the secondary effects are fairly inconsequential, an increased carrying capacity, slightly less fall damage, the temporary HP boost is pretty solid. Now, while ability checks are not as strong as saving throws, they can still be pretty solid. This does require concentration, but that's something that all buff spells require as a way to balance them, as if you didn't, casters would be far stronger than they already are. Still, this spell lasts for an hour, so you get some pretty solid duration out of it. Also, if you upcast it, you can target additional creatures, so this doesn't have to remain a single target buff. Still, this isn't the strongest buff, as aside from the 2d6 temp HP, you don't really get much combat benefits from it, so it remains at the bottom of the list. And at number 9, we have Crusaders Mantle, a 3rd level paladin spell. And what it does is create an aura with a 30-foot radius, giving each non-hostile creature in the aura, including you, an extra 1d4 radiant damage when hit with a weapon attack. The aura is centered on you and moves as you do, like your normal paladin aura. Now, this is a relatively simple spell, but can be useful if your party consists of a lot of martials. Paladins don't gain access to 3rd level spells until level 9, and all of you would have extra attacks, meaning this is an extra 64 damage from you and your allies each turn. And this could be more if you have access to something like a monk, which makes lots of individual attacks, or less if you have a rogue, which will be more likely making a single attack. The biggest downside of this spell is that it requires concentration, which even with proficiency in constitution saves, through something like the Resilient feat, can be hard to maintain when you're a frontliner. The other downside is that it has a really short duration at only 1 minute, meaning that it won't last longer than a single combat. And for paladins who most of the time just want to use their Divine Smite feature, this is a loss of 48 damage on that front. But it does very much fit into the theme if you're going for a more team-oriented paladin leader, instead of a single avenging knight. Still, due to the downsides and the fact that it can only be taken by a single class, this takes a lower spot on the list. And at number 8, we have the cantrip Resistance. What this spell does is let you touch a willing creature, and by doing so, you can add a d4 to a saving throw within the next 1 minute duration of the spell. The reason this spell even makes this list is for 2 reasons. First off, it's a cantrip, so it has unlimited number of daily uses. And secondly, you can roll this d4 before or after you make the save. So if you roll so low that it wouldn't have helped, or high enough that you would have succeeded anyway, you can save the d4 for the roll when you only fail by a few points. The weakness of this spell is that it has a range of touch, meaning that it isn't really suited for combats, as it does still eat your action rather than a reaction like Absorb Elements, Silvery Barbs, or Shield. However, if you are delving through a dungeon in which you're running into traps, or if you're paranoid of ambushes, then you can just be casting and recasting the spell over and over as you make your way through the dungeon to help yourself or an ally avoid them. So it has potential, if you know what you're walking into, but should never be cast during combat, leaving it at another low spot on this list, only being at the previous 2 spots because it can be used whenever you want. And at number 7, we have Enlarge Reduce. This is a 2nd level spell which causes a creature or an object to become 1 size larger or smaller. The best part of this is its versatility because it can be used both as a buff spell and as a debuff spell. As a buff, you can use it to enlarge the target so that its size increases by 1 class from small to medium to large, etc, etc. This also gives the target advantage on strength saving throws, which while uncommon, can have their uses. The target's weapons are also enlarged to fit the creature's new size, and due to this increase, they deal an extra 1d4 damage with their attacks. If there isn't enough space for the creature to fully enlarge, they instead attain the maximum size possible in the space available, which if you are persuasive enough, and with a lenient enough DM, could allow you to debuff a creature by enlarging it too. Sure, they're bigger, stronger, and deal more damage now, but if you're trying to escape from them down a smaller path, then maybe you enlarge the target so they can't follow you. That said, the main debuff with this spell is the reduce side of it, where the target's size is decreased by 1 class from small to tiny, medium to small, and so on and so forth. This does exactly the opposite of enlarge. The target now has disadvantage on saving throws, and their weapons deal 1d4 less damage, but still with a minimum of 1. And if you have a grappler in your party, this spell will be vital when going up against larger creatures, as you can only grapple a creature that is 1 size larger than you. So your medium-sized human grappler becomes large size, allowing them to grapple huge-sized creatures. An unwilling creature does get to make a constitution save to try and avoid this, which, as we've covered many times, is by far the worst save to ask a creature to make, as most of them have quite high constitution scores. Still, this isn't something to worry about while using it as a buff, as the friendly creature will probably be a willing one. The bad save aside, the only real downside of this spell is that it eats up your concentration. Also, it only lasts for 1 minute, which, like Crusader's Mantle, means that it will only last for a single combat. Still, all in all, this is a pretty solid buff spell generally, so it takes the number 7 spot on this list. And at number 6, we have the cantrip Guidance. This spell is very similar to Resistance, but far better. What it does is let you touch 1 willing creature, then the target can roll a d4, and add that number rolled to 1 ability check of its choice. Just like Resistance, the d4 can be rolled before or after making the ability check. What makes Guidance better than Resistance is that it lets you add the d4 to ability checks instead of saving throws. You see, saving throws are far more common in combat than outside of it, but Resistance isn't good in combat when saving throws are most needed, as it requires an action to cast, leaving you unable to deal damage. Guidance, on the other hand, can be easily used out of combat where most ability checks occur. Also, ability checks are just far more common in campaigns than saving throws are, so this would come up far more often. As long as you don't need to be sneaky about it, once a single party member gets this spell, the whole group basically has an extra d4 for every ability check for the rest of the game, as long as the party sticks together. And at number 5, we have Intellect Fortress, which is a 3rd level spell from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. What it does is grant resistance to psychic damage and advantage on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saving throws to a target. There are over 500 spells to date in 5th edition, and less than 20 of them deal psychic damage. That means having resistance to it is rarely going to come up, as only a handful of creatures even have access to this damage type. Still, the advantage on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saving throws alone is very good, since those are relatively common saves to encounter when fighting caster-type enemies, and these are the saves where, if you fail, they will more often than not result in a loss of control effect, taking you out of the fight. While the spell does require concentration, it lasts for a full hour, which is pretty nice. Getting advantage on a roll from a numbers standpoint is basically equivalent to getting a +5 to your roll. And for such critical saving throws, this is quite a powerful buff. Where you would probably get the most bang for your buck though with this spell would be in an Underdark campaign, as Mind Flayers and their minions are rather potent spellcasters who also deal a considerable amount of psychic damage with their attacks. And besides, when you have a bunch of tentacle-faced monsters that want to eat your brain, and little brains that want your body, it's good to have protection at all times. Even when you are not fighting creatures that deal psychic damage, getting an advantage on 3 saving throws is just a really solid ability, which is why it puts it at the number 5 spot. And at number 4, we have the 1st level spell, Heroism. What this spell allows you to do is touch a willing creature, and until the spell ends, the creature is immune to being frightened and gains temporary hit points equal to your spellcasting ability modifier at the start of each of its turns. Now, the immunity to being frightened is a good effect, but it doesn't come up all that often. The ability to gain 5 temporary hit points every turn, though, is huge. The spell lasts for a minute, so if you have the spell the entire time, you can get up to 50 temporary hit points, assuming you have maxed out your casting stat at 20. The temp HP does go away after the spell ends and does not stack, so you do actually need to take damage every turn in order to gain its full effect. But if you cast this spell at the start of a fight, it should last you the entire encounter, as most fights last around 3 to 5 rounds anyway. This could also be considered a healing spell, given the sheer amount of extra health it gives you. However, while it does give temporary hit points, it doesn't actually heal, which is why it didn't make it into our top 10 healing spells video. A great target for this in the party would probably be the Barbarian, as Frightened is one of the few things the Rage feature does not protect them from, at least until 6th level with Mindless Rage, but that's only for the Path of the Berserker Barbarian. And at number 3, we have Shield of Faith. This is a 1st level spell that grants the creature a magic shield for 10 minutes. This requires only a bonus action to cast, which frees up your action, letting you also cast a cantrip, or make an attack on the same turn as you cast this spell. This shield increases the target's AC by 2 for the duration, just like a normal shield would, but no hands or proficiency is required. Any spell or item that gives you bonus to your AC is inherently good, which is why it's especially rare to see this effect on items and spells. Most spells that grant you bonus to your AC don't actually give you a plus to your AC, rather just set your AC. Barkskin lets your AC become 16, Mage Armor sets it to 13 plus your Dex modifier, and so on and so on. Being able to give yourself or someone else a +2 to the AC with only a 1st level spell slot is very useful. Most tier 1 and 2 enemies only have a +3 or 4 to hit, and if you cast this on a frontliner who has a decent AC already, most creatures are going to have a very low chance of hitting them. Take a paladin for example. If he has full plate armor, giving him an AC of 18, as well as a shield which gives him a +2 on top of that for a total AC of 20. Once you cast this, he'll have a whopping 22 AC, making him nigh unhittable, outside of crits. This spell is excellent at providing that extra defense that you really need at low levels before you can afford magical armors. And at number 2, we have the first level spell, Bless. Now, when you ask a 5e player what the go-to buff spell is, Bless will usually be their first pick. This is because it is a very versatile and useful spell that you can get from the very start. What it does is let you target up to 3 creatures of your choice. Whenever one of those targets makes an attack roll or saving throw before the spell ends, you can add a d4 to the roll. This spell is similar to Resistance in that it lets you add a d4 to any of your saving throws, but it's just far, far better. This is because the d4 can be added to your attack rolls as well as your saving throws. And unlike Resistance, this isn't just a single d4 during its duration, Bless lets you add a d4 to every roll within its duration. It also lets you target 3 creatures compared to Resistance's 1, and if you upcast it, you can target additional creatures. With a single first level spell slot, you're giving all of your allies an extra d4 to all of their attacks and saves. And this is just incredible. So much so that this spell can see use even in higher tiers of play. Having the ability to choose any saving throw or attack roll makes this spell one of the best buff spells for any situation. And while it was narrowly being out by the top spot, it was a contentious fight for which one was better. And finally, at number 1, we have the 3rd level spell, Haste. This is a must-have for any caster, as what it does is double the target speed, gives them +2 AC, gives them advantage on dex saving throws, and an additional action each turn. As we talked about in the number 3 spot with Shield of Faith, getting extra AC is really good. The fact that this spell does this in addition to giving the target another action and doubling their speed makes this spell quite strong. Now, the extra action is limited, so you can't use it for anything you want, as it only lets you dash, disengage, hide, use an object, or make a single attack, meaning that it doesn't stack with things like extra attack. Still, an additional swing of the sword is kind of like having an extra attack, which is nothing to scoff at. Another useful part of the spell is if you want to charge in with your double movement speed, attack a target and retreat after, using your extra action disengage, this allows a slightly squishier class to avoid potentially getting hit. A rogue is probably the best target because they can attack and hide, but also unlike other martial classes, they only get a single attack on their turn normally, so this allows them to have a second chance if they miss. Now, Haste does have the rather serious downside that when the spell ends, the creature can't move or take actions until after its next turn. This isn't bad if you can end the combat before the spell runs out, but if you lose concentration, this can make the hasted character very vulnerable, so you really have to watch out for this and keep yourself protected when casting it. Or you could try to pull some shenanigans and try casting this on an enemy. The target does have to be willing, but they could also just be dumb. As once cast, you then immediately drop your concentration to make them vulnerable, but this will usually work once at your table, so don't count on doing this more than once before your DM gets mad. Alright, and that's the video. What do you think? Are there any better buffs that deserve to be on the list? Do you agree with this channel's manager that Haste isn't as good as Bless? If so, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well as ideas for future videos just like this one down in the comments.